The winter of 1943 arrived like a sentence handed down by history itself. In the frozen wastes outside Stalingrad, 300,000 German soldiers had surrendered or died. In the skies above the Ruhr Valley, British bombers painted the night orange. And in a bunker deep beneath the Wolf Schanze, Adolf Hitler bent over a blueprint and smiled. He was looking at a tank. Not just any tank, a colossus. A land battleship that would render every weapon on Earth obsolete. Its armor would be 12 inches thick, enough to laugh at any shell the Allies could fire. Its gun would penetrate anything that moved. And its presence on the battlefield would break the enemy's will before a single shot was fired. The engineers called it Maus, the Maus, a bitter joke for a machine that would weigh more than 180 tons. Ferdinand Porsche stood beside the Führer, nodding as Hitler's finger traced the turret outline. Porsche was one of the Golden Boys, an engineer whose sports cars had won races, whose reputation had won Hitler's ear. Now he would build something that had never existed, a fortress that could move. Or so the dream promised. Outside that bunker, Germany was bleeding. The Eastern Front consumed men like a furnace consumes coal. The Atlantic Wall crumbled under Allied pressure. Supply lines stretched and snapped. But inside, in the dim glow of desk lamps and the shadow of swastika banners, Hitler spoke of wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, that would turn the tide. The jet fighter, the rocket bomb, the super tank. Logic had left the room years ago. What remained was mythology dressed in steel. Porsche returned to his drawing board with orders that bordered on the divine. Build the impossible, and build it now. Around him, Germany's industrial might, what remained of it, would be bent toward a single vision. Not 10 good tanks, not 100 reliable trucks. One monument, one beast. The first sketches looked like something from a fever dream. A hull so wide it barely fit on paper. Treads that could crush a car flat. A turret that required its own crane just to test the rotation. One engineer, a man named Klaus Müller, composited of a dozen real voices lost to time, looked at the dimensions and did the math. Then he did it again, then he set down his pencil and stared at the wall. "Sir," he said quietly to his supervisor, "this machine will weigh more than a locomotive." "Then it will crush like a locomotive," came the reply. "Sir, no bridge in Europe can hold it." "Then we will build new bridges." "Sir, no engine we have can move it." A pause, then make one. And so the dream metastasized into orders, and orders into overtime shifts, and overtime shifts into a factory floor that ran 20 hours a day under the smoke of distant air raids. The Maus was born not from strategy, but from obsession, not from need, but from the desperate hunger to believe in invincibility when everything else had begun to crumble. In the blueprint room, someone had written a note in the margin, half erased. "God forgive us for what we are about to build." No one noticed it. No one had time. The monster was already stirring. Act 2. Building the Beast. The Alket factory in Berlin became a cathedral of iron and fire. By day, the workers arrived in waves, engineers, welders, machinists, laborers pulled from every corner of the Reich. By night, the furnaces never cooled. Molten steel poured into molds large enough to swallow a man. Cranes groaned under loads that made their rivets scream. And slowly, impossibly, the Maus began to take shape. The numbers were obscene. 188 tons at full combat weight, 10 meters long, 3.6 meters tall, armor plates 12 inches thick on the front, cast in single pieces that took weeks to cool without cracking. The turret alone weighed 55 tons, more than an entire Panzer IV. For comparison, the Tiger tank, already considered heavy at 57 tons, was a scout car beside this colossus. The Panther, Germany's workhorse, weighed 45 tons. You could stack 4 Panthers on a scale and the Maus would still tip it. But weight was the point. Weight meant protection. Weight meant invincibility. Or so they told themselves. Klaus Müller stood on the factory floor and watched a single track link being lowered into place. It was the size of a dining table and weighed more than he did. There were hundreds of these links, thousands of bolts. A transmission system so complex it required its own cooling system, which required its own cooling system. He opened his notebook and wrote, "We are building a god of metal, but I suspect it will refuse to live." The engine, a Daimler-Benz MB 509 designed for ships, roared to life during the first test. The sound was magnificent, volcanic. The hull shuddered. Dust fell from the rafters. And then the transmission, stressed beyond its tolerances, began to whine like a dying animal. They shut it down, redesigned the gears, tried again. The tank moved, 6 meters, then stopped. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank gone. Someone laughed, not a joyful laugh, the kind of laugh you hear in a hospital waiting room when the doctor walks out shaking his head. But the orders were clear. Make it work. So they made it work. Sort of. A second prototype began construction even as the first sat broken, surrounded by toolboxes and cursing mechanics. Resources flowed in from across occupied Europe, steel from France, copper from Poland, rubber from the dying trade routes to the east. Every resource that arrived at the Maus factory was a resource that didn't arrive at the front. Klaus noticed this. Others noticed it too. But silence was safer than speaking, so they returned to their welding masks and their blueprints and pretended not to count the cost. During a test in December 1943, they rolled the prototype onto a field outside the factory. The ground was soft from autumn rain. The Maus sank 8 inches on the first turn, its trads churning mud like a ship trapped in shallow water. Engineers scrambled with wooden planks, trying to give it traction. It took 6 hours to move it 30 meters. A nearby bridge, rated for 50 tons, was tested. The Maus weighed nearly 4 times that. The bridge groaned, cracked, and sagged in the middle before they even attempted a crossing. Porsche, ever the optimist, proposed a solution. The Maus would drive under rivers instead of over them. Watertight seals, a snorkel for the engine. It would wade across riverbeds like a mechanical crocodile. They built the snorkel. It worked technically, but finding a river shallow enough, with a bed firm enough, with banks gradual enough for the Maus to enter and exit. There were 3 such rivers in all of Germany. And yet the dream persisted. Hitler visited once, surrounded by SS guards and sycophants. He walked around the prototype, one hand resting on the cold steel, and smiled. He said, "This will make the Bolsheviks tremble." No one mentioned that the Bolsheviks were already in Poland. That night, Klaus sat in the factory's break room, smoking a cigarette down to the filter. Another engineer, a man named Otto, whose son had died in North Africa, sat across from him. "Do you think it will ever fight?" Otto asked. Klaus didn't answer immediately. He looked through the window at the Maus, hulking in the darkness, lit by a single floodlight. Klaus said slowly, "I think we've built the world's most expensive monument. We just don't know it yet." Otto nodded. He understood. They both returned to work. The beast demanded feeding. Act 3. The monster turns on its maker. By the spring of 1944, the Maus existed in a state of paradox, fully built, yet completely useless. The first prototype could move, technically, at a maximum speed of 13 kilometers per hour on flat paved roads. A man could jog faster. Any incline above 15 degrees was impossible. Any turn sharper than a wide arc required stopping, reversing, stopping again, repositioning. A tank that couldn't maneuver wasn't a tank. It was a bunker with an engine. But the real horror emerged in the logistics. The Maus consumed fuel like a dying star consumes matter. 7,000 liters to fill the tanks, enough to run 3 Panther tanks for a week. On a combat deployment, it would burn through its reserves in under 100 kilometers, assuming perfect terrain. And there was no perfect terrain. Rail transport was impossible. No flat car could bear the weight. The tunnels were too narrow. The bridges too weak. To move the Maus by train, they would have to disassemble it completely, transport it in pieces, and rebuild it at the destination, by which point the war would have moved 3 countries away. Road transport was a fantasy. Every road the Maus touched crumbled. Paving stones cracked like eggshells. Wooden bridges collapsed on sight. Concrete bridges required engineering surveys before even attempting a crossing. Someone calculated that to move the Maus from Berlin to the Eastern Front, assuming no resistance, perfect weather, and divine intervention, would take 6 weeks and require building 17 new bridges. The Eastern Front collapsed in 3. Klaus stood in a meeting room where officers and engineers shouted at each other in a language of denial. One officer insisted they simply needed better roads. Another suggested multiple fuel convoys following the Maus at all times. A third proposed abandoning the Maus in a defensive position and using it as a fixed fortification. "Then it's not a tank," Klaus said quietly. Everyone stopped. "If it doesn't move, it's not a tank," he repeated. "It's a very expensive pillbox that the enemy will simply go around." The officer in charge slammed his hand on the table. "The Führer has decreed this weapon will strike fear into the heart of our enemies." "The Führer," Klaus said, even more quietly, "is not an engineer." The room went silent. Klaus was transferred to a different project the next day. No one saw him again at the Maus facility, but his words lingered. By summer, Allied air raids intensified. The factories shook nightly. Production lines for the second prototype stuttered and stalled. Workers diverted to build anti-aircraft defenses. Steel shipments delayed. Blueprints lost in fires. And the Maus sat in its factory bay, untouched, gathering dust. One night, a young tank driver, barely 20, assigned to test rotations for the turret, climbed onto the hull with a canteen of schnapps. He sat on the turret, leg dangling, and looked at the stars through the holes in the factory roof. Another driver joined him. "Do you think we'll ever use it?" the first one asked. "No," said the second. "Then why are we still here?" The second driver took a long drink. "Because they can't admit they were wrong." "Who's they?" "Everyone above us." They sat in silence, 2 men on a monument to madness, while somewhere beyond the city the sound of artillery grew closer. The Maus had become a symbol, not of strength, but of denial, not of hope, but of the impossible distance between what was wished for and what could be. It was a machine that existed only in the space between fantasy and collapse. And that space was closing fast. Act 4. Feeding the Maus. The clearest measure of insanity is what you're willing to sacrifice for a delusion. While the Maus consumed steel, copper, rubber, and countless man-hours in a Berlin factory, the German army bled for want of basic supplies. Panzer divisions on the Eastern Front wrote desperate reports. Tanks immobilized for lack of spare parts. Half-tracks cannibalizing their own dead for treads. Fuel rations cut so severely that units couldn't maneuver, even when the tactical situation demanded it. A Tiger commander wrote to his superiors, "We have 14 tanks, 4 can move, 1 can fight. Please send parts, not promises." The reply never came. The trains carrying those parts had been diverted to the Maus program. For the cost of a single Maus prototype, in materials, labor, and facility resources, Germany could have produced 10 Panther medium tanks, 30 Stug 3 assault guns, 200 half-tracks, enough spare parts to repair 500 broken vehicles. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Yet, the trains kept running. Steel shipments marked highest priority rolled into Berlin while frontline units improvised repairs with wire and prayers. Engineers who could have been maintaining battle-worthy tanks instead fitted snorkels onto a machine that would never see combat. A soldier named Friedrich, stationed outside Kursk, wrote a letter home that was intercepted by sensors and never delivered. He wrote, "They tell us the wonder weapons are coming, the secret tanks, the miracle guns. I think of this every time I watch my friends die because our tank broke down 50 kilometers from the front and no one has the parts to fix it. I think of this when we burn furniture to stay warm because there's no fuel for the stoves. Where are these miracles? What God do they serve?" The answer was vanity, pride, the inability to admit that the premise was flawed from the beginning. In the Alcat factory, the engineers knew. They'd known for months. Some had known from the start. Otto, the engineer whose son died in North Africa, began keeping a journal. He wrote in code, disguising it as technical notes, but the meaning was clear to anyone who looked closely. We are feeding a corpse. Every day, more steel, more hours, more sweat. The beast grows heavier but never stronger. Outside, the war is lost. Inside, we polish its armor. I think of my son's grave and wonder if he would understand what his father has become. In April 1944, as Soviet forces pushed toward Poland and Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble fields, Ferdinand Porsche submitted a request for additional resources, more steel allotments, more skilled labor, more engine development time. The request was approved. On the same day, a panzer regiment was disbanded due to lack of operational vehicles. The irony was so perfect, it stopped being ironic and became simply obscene. By late summer, even the most fervent believers began to falter. A procurement officer, reviewing supply manifests, noticed the disparity and brought it to his commander's attention. "Sir, we're sending enough copper to the Maus program to rewire half the tanks in Army Group Center." "I'm aware." "Sir, Army Group Center is—" "I said I'm aware." The commander stared at the manifest, then he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He said, "The decision has been made at the highest levels. We are not in a position to question it." "Even if the highest levels are wrong?" The commander looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, especially then. The conversation ended. The Maus program continued. And in the factory, as the second prototype inched toward completion, someone spray-painted a message on the wall in the dead of night. "Für wen?" For whom? No one erased it. Act 5. The Maus and the Mausoleum. The end came not with thunder, but with silence. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery echoed across the Seelow Heights and Berlin prepared for its final act, engineers at the Alcat factory received their last orders. Destroy the prototypes. Deny them to the enemy. They planted demolition charges in the second prototype and blew it apart. The explosion was almost therapeutic. Months of frustration released in a single blast of fire and twisted metal. But the first prototype was too complete to fully destroy. They removed the engine, drained the fuel, and stripped what components they could carry. Then they walked away, leaving it sitting in the factory like a beached whale. The Soviets found it 3 days later. They stared, they measured, they photographed. Then they did what conquerors do. They claimed it as a trophy. Using parts from both prototypes, Soviet engineers assembled a single working example. They transported it, slowly, carefully, with engineering effort that proved it could have been moved, just never efficiently enough to matter, to the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. It sits there still. A monument to nothing, a relic of the impossible made real and then immediately made irrelevant. Tourists photograph it. Children climb the barriers to touch the treads. Historians study it and shake their heads. The metal has oxidized to a dull gray-brown, the color of old blood or ancient rust. The mouse never fired a shot in anger, never crossed a battlefield, never struck fear into an enemy's heart, except perhaps the fear of absurdity, that humans could dream so grandly and fail so completely. But it did do one thing perfectly. It became a symbol, not of German engineering prowess, though that was formidable, not of Hitler's military genius, which was always an oxymoron, but of the fatal distance between desire and reality, between what an empire tells itself and what the world actually is. Every civilization builds monuments to its own mythology. Egypt had pyramids. Rome had aqueducts. Nazi Germany had the mouse. A tank that couldn't move became the perfect metaphor for a war that could no longer progress. An army that consumed itself chasing invincibility. A regime that demanded miracles and received only the corpse of its own hubris, dressed in 12 inches of steel. Klaus Müller, if he survived the war, and records suggest he might have, never spoke publicly about his time on the Mouse project. But a diary was found decades later in a Berlin flea market, unsigned but dated to match his service. The last entry reads, "We built it because we were told to. We continued because stopping would mean admitting we'd been wrong. And in the end, we finished it because finishing was easier than facing what we'd wasted. I think of all the tanks we didn't build, all the soldiers who died waiting for machines we could have made, and I look at what we made instead, this silent, immobile God, and I understand something about humanity I wish I didn't. We are capable of extraordinary things, and extraordinarily stupid things, often at the same time. The mouse taught me that genius and madness are not opposites, they are neighbors, and sometimes, when no one is looking, they are the same house." In the Kubinka Museum, the mouse sits under fluorescent lights, its turret frozen at a 45-degree angle. Rust blooms around the bolt heads. Birds nest in the exhaust ports. A plaque beside it reads, "Panzerkampfwagen VIII Maus, Super Heavy Tank, Nazi Germany, 1944, never saw combat." It doesn't mention the cost, the resources, the men who could have been saved, the war that was lost while engineers polished the dream of invincibility. But the tank itself says everything. It is enormous. It is impressive. It is useless. And it is in the end exactly what it was always meant to be. A monument to obsession. A mausoleum to madness. A mouse that ate an army. And a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the enemy at the gates, it's the delusion in the drawing room, demanding one more miracle, one more sacrifice, one more impossible dream. The mouse never moved when it mattered, But its shadow moves still, across history, a warning carved in steel. Beware what you build when you stop asking why.